Good afternoon, or still good morning, everyone, wherever you're watching from. Thank you very much for joining us today for the second term of the OI Digital History, Digital Humanities Coffee House. My name is Jim Ambuske. I am co-head of our two studios at the Roy Rosenzweig Center for History and New Media at George Mason University, and I'm very pleased to be co-hosting this coffee house with friend and colleague Martha Howard of the Omohundro Institute, who you all know and love. And today we're very excited to kick off this term with our colleagues from Vanderbilt University, Dr. Jane Landers, who is the Gertrude Conway Vanderbilt Professor of History and the Director of the Slave Society's Digital Archive at Vanderbilt University. SSDA preserves the oldest and largest collection of historical documents for Africans in the Atlantic world. And since 2015, she has served as a U.S. member of UNESCO's International Scientific Committee for the Routes of Enslaved Peoples. Her award-winning monographs include Black Society in Spanish Florida and Atlantic Creoles in the Age of Revolutions. And Daniel Genkins is the Digital Lab Architect and the SSDA Curator at Vanderbilt University. And I'm very happy to welcome them both to the floor for a few introductory remarks before we play a little video. Jane, Daniel?
Thanks so much, Jim and Martha, both for inviting us to be part of this. And I enjoyed seeing Simon's earlier to learn how to do this. We're always interested in having some discussion about our project, and we hope that it'll come through in the questions and answers. But I won't say too much more right now, maybe after the video, just to say that this whole thing started back in the day when it was about 2001 or two when I applied for an NEH collaborative research grant. And you had to have international partners. So I had Maritza Soares from UFI in Brazil, and I had Paul Lovejoy in Canada. And we started with the two most African places we could think of at that point, Brazil and Cuba, where I've worked for most of my career. And I thought it was a one-off, but we just kept applying for grants, and fortunately we're pretty successful. And so we'd have a lot of smaller projects then thereafter. And we have a new one coming up in Mompox, Colombia in our spring break in March. And so it just keeps going, fortunately. And fortunately, Vanderbilt has adopted us, and our wonderful university librarian, John Shaw, has agreed to take over the heavy lift of, the funding for the servers and the storage and the space and everything, so that I don't have to keep writing these grants anymore. And I'm very grateful to him. And also, I'm very grateful because now he has also taken Daniel on a full-time position to do a lot of this work, and I can maybe retire in peace and not think it's going to all fall apart.
And I think I may chime in briefly after the video as well, but I think, Jane, if you're ready, I think we can go ahead and start with the video.
The people who know the name of their ancestor, or even kind of know broadly where their ancestors were and when, can someday go to the archive to learn more about their story, where they came from, and how they lived their lives.
Roughly 6,000 people work at Vanderbilt. Any one of them can change the world. I'm Jad Abumrad, new professor here at Vandy, and today I'm meeting, bing, a team that is marrying guerrilla preservation and AI to capture millions of stories before they vanish. We'll start with Dr. Jane Landers. The term guerrilla preservation. Can you tell me about that term and where that came from?
Yeah, it was the speed of it, the small scale of it. And when we go somewhere, we train the local students or archivists, help them organize everything, and we put it up for everybody to use, because this is important history that could be erased any time, and we need to preserve it.
Okay, so here's the basic situation. One of the many, many, many horrors of slavery is that there are so few records, which means so many stories lost. But Jane had an idea.
We started out in Cuba. Next was Brazil, Colombia, St. Augustine, Florida in the U.S. We have a little bit from Uruguay.
Her idea was, in those places where enslaved people were brought, there were churches, and the priests in those churches were obsessed with trying to collect as many souls as possible for the church.
They'll send priests out to those remote areas and then would baptize people.
And Jane thought if she could just get those records, we could at least know their names.
La Morena Libre, Lara, which means she's some type of mixed race African descendant woman. She's free.
This is Justin Jones, a PhD student at SSDA.
Her name is Lara Cabrera, and she lives on number 8 River Street.
In the religious records, the most important and the most well-kept are the baptismal records. It tells you the date, what church, what priest is doing it.
And each of these churches is one that you and your team went into
Yes.
and dug through the basement of, I'm imagining, to find these documents.
Yes.
The documents that they found were not in good shape.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. When we started opening some of the books, you would get to a certain point where the pages were stuck together by bug excrement. Sometimes they're so damaged you can't open it. It's like pieces of lace.
Yeah.
And then the ink that they're written in has got iron in it that also eats through the paper.
Oh my God. It has big fist-sized holes in it. Not quite, but I think to myself, that's a human being who just vanished. And we're not going to know them.
Yeah.
When we were there, Jane showed us a picture someone had sent her of people in Cuba shoveling old records into a furnace.
Somebody has decided, what do they need these old documents for? Let's get rid of it.
Oh God, this makes me want to cry.
Isn't it sad?
You must feel constant pressure to get these things before they slip away.
Yeah, because while we're talking here, stuff is disappearing.
So far, her and her team have rescued 700,000 documents, which makes this the largest database of its kind anywhere in the world. Problem is, it would take many, many lifetimes to read it all.
There's thousands of people in this one book, most of whom don't appear anywhere else in the historical record that we can learn about. You know,
See, that, when you say that, that kind of gives me chills.
That's where Dan comes in.
I'm Daniel Genkins. I am an associate professor of, that's false. I'm super like stage fright, and I'm an assistant professor.
Okay.
I went to Professor Landers. I said, Jane, you have this digital project. I will help you kind of bring it up to speed technically. I'm really interested in history, but also programming and computer science. You need people in the room that are both.
This is almost impossible to read now.
Well, especially since you don't have your glasses on today.
This is Elvira Abaji Morel, a postdoctoral fellow who specializes in Portuguese translation.
A volume could take around 5 months to transcribe, yes. So that's what we are trying to do with AI.
So the very first thing is to train the computer to recognize regions of the image that have text.
When we are transcribing, we hope to train the machine to understand the calligraphy. For example, signatures, names, locations.
Dan says he's very close, maybe months away from unleashing his AI on the entire collection.
We're talking about hundreds of thousands or even maybe millions of people's history recovered.
So the biggest fantasy is to be able to search in someone's name and then it can show me on this format.
Imagine a world where you type in your ancestor's name and boom, you see that name situated in a vast web of information. The ship they were brought in on, who else was on that ship, every stop they made. And in that small way, you can know that person for the first time.
There was one time where I was putting one of the entries in and I noticed that the date that I just typed in was the same date that it was that current day. And someone was celebrating a child being born on this day, and they had their whole life leading up to that, their whole life after that.
These are who her parents were. These are who her godparents were. These are who those godparents' parents were. And that's the real power here, right? We're not just constructing single lives in isolation. We're reconstructing communities.
That video was filmed in, I think, the summer of 2023. Which was kind of a fateful moment as far as the technical part of the project was concerned. The following fall, all the large language models started rolling out computer vision capability. So in the kind of 18 months since then, what we've built on the technical side is kind of a proof of concept pipeline that essentially does the thing that I was describing in that video. So starts from an image of one of our documents, and without any human intervention ends with kind of a structured representation of the information about people and places and institutions that appear in that image. So I say proof of concept because it does not yet work for, the full contents of the archive, but for, images that are well suited for the techniques we have in place, it works pretty well. And so this is in some ways maybe an alternative, a slightly different approach to Transcribus, which some of you may have heard about, but one that I'm very kind of optimistic about. And I think, at least for our project, but I think also for other projects, this is a solution that's fairly close for being able to deliver like production level data that can be used to enhance the usefulness of these collections. So I'm glad to talk more about that. I can also talk about kind of the more fundamental website and data pieces of the project in terms of our backend, how data is stored, in terms of our front end, how the website itself has been built. But really any or all of those digital aspects of the project, I'm glad to talk more about.
Maybe I could say a little thank you also to Jad Abramrod for doing the video. But one of the things that isn't really quite mentioned in it that I wish I had remembered to say at the time was that one of the things that we are proudest of, or that I'm the most focused on, I guess, is how you can track over several centuries ethnic groups over time and ethnic associations over time that aren't in other sorts of documents. Certainly not much you might know a general area of departure of a ship or a general area of arrival, but these are about real human beings, and they are describing themselves, their ethnic group in these records, and they are picking their godparents. And it's often, as David Wheat and others who've used it have found, they're picking from their own ethnic group to have godparents of the same families. They're forming religious brotherhoods or irmandades, cofradias of the same ethnic groups with their own officers. We have all of those sorts of documents as well. We have confirmation, we have marriage, and we have burial. Baptisms that were focused in the video are the largest group because that was, to the priest's mind, the most important. But all those other forms of religious documentation are what we focused on as well. And that was my choice because when I went into Cuba, it was difficult to work in the state archives, and I had a letter of introduction from the only Black bishop in Florida at the time, and that's how it works in Latin America. It's who you know and who you connect to, and so that letter got me in the door in Cuba in the special period, and we just kept going through those. And now more recently, others have started. Other of our projects have started adding in more civil records and notarial records, but our original focus were these church ones just because they paid so much attention to social units, family units. You also get occupations, owners, and so on and so forth. And we find a lot of neat surprises that we didn't expect either that are outside the formula. Um, Things like records that are supposed to not exist anymore, we'll find. Um, We've recently in the 19th century Cuban records where you're supposed to be in the era of abolition and the British are interdicting ships and so on, and mixed record commissions are happening in Havana. We start to find the adults that are being baptized also have the information about the slave ships on which they arrived. And so we just keep finding new things all the time out of what were supposed to be rather formulaic records.
Well, Jane, this is quite fascinating. I think I have a million questions, but I'll just try to ask a couple, and then just a reminder for folks: please do either pop questions in the chat. I'm happy to vocalize those for you, or raise your hand and come on screen and engage in the discussion as well. But I have a sort of a pre-AI question and then a post-AI question. So the pre-AI question would be, what did you expect or what did you hope to accomplish with this project before the rapid emergence of AI in terms of generative AI and structured data in this way? And then, Daniel, I have a question for you afterwards, which is, you mentioned Transcribus. What is the size of the data set that you had to train your model on, and what models or what generative AI tool were you using to actually build the model that you needed to process this amount of data, and then, as you say in the video, soon to unleash this across the world?
Was I supposed to say something about what was my original goal?
Yes, please. Yeah.
Okay.
Before Cybernet.
Well, my original goal was basically to get it before it's gone, because my professors, my wonderful professors at the University of Florida, took me to Cuba for the first time as a graduate student, and I learned how difficult it is to work in places that have no resources. The government is not supporting, the climate is terrible, the bugs are bad, fires and disasters. Now we have even worse climate disasters with flooding, hurricanes, and so on in Cuba. And some of the records that we did in a very rough way in those years are really the only thing that exists now. Those originals are gone. So when I said guerrilla preservation, really it was a joke from one of our other grad students that went with me to Cuba. Andrew McMichael came up with that term, but it was like we go into rough places where nobody knows we're coming, and we bring our cameras, and I talk my way in, and then they set up and do all the filming, and it's preserved. And so guerrilla preservation in the sense that, some of these places like where we're going in March are not really, standard places you would work.
So I joined SSDA as I was finishing my PhD with Jane. PhD in history, by the way, so no formal CS training. Anybody can do this. Around 2017, 2018. And at that point,
And he did a nice dissertation too.
well, the first half of the year, I focused on like data wrangling for the archive, and the second half of the year, I wrote the dissertation. It was a really fun year. So I came on at that point, and at that point, the primary kind of digital challenge that SSDA was facing was the need to get all our data in one place, ensure that the data was safe and secure, and make sure that it was as accessible as possible on the web. And so that's kind of what I did for the first year. But I always had in the back of my mind, I don't know that I knew that I was going to like come back and stay at Vanderbilt, but I always had in the back of my mind the next step for this archive and archives like this one would be to, because these documents are hard to read, right? Bottom line, hard to read. Paleography is hard, even for a modern speaker of Spanish or Portuguese, a fluent speaker. So the back of my mind was always that we are going to need some kind of automated way to transcribe these documents. I also had the experience as a grad student of transcribing one of these volumes. So I, kind of knew what that entailed too, and knew that, while we can do it, and, we as scholars who have these specialized skill sets can do a really good job. And don't worry, a better job than AI can do now and a better job than AI can do in the short term for sure. It takes a long time to do a really good job of transcribing. So I kind of had in the back of my mind from the moment I joined the project that ultimately we were going to do this using some kind of automated tooling. Now, obviously it came quicker and in a more robust way than I conceived of at that point. But what that meant was from the beginning of my involvement in the project, we were building, and Jim, this is going to get to your question, we were building training data that was specifically geared for informing some kind of supervised learning type process some point down the road. And so what that means was rather than having the other grad students who are transcribing to Word, I made them all transcribe XML. Not TEI, we can talk about why I made that choice, but they were essentially transcribing in a structured way so that I would have data right off the jump that I could use to interact with programmatically. So the answer to your first of your technical questions was, I just checked this on my other monitor. We have roughly 1,000 folios transcribed in a structured way. And some of those were transcribed natively as XML. Some of them actually more recently were transcribed natively as JSON. Some of them were transcribed originally in Word and then programmatically transformed into structured data. So those were a little messier for reasons. So in terms of, training data for the task of image transcription, we have roughly 1,000 folios. I should also say, so Jane spoke a second ago about the distinction between kind of the ecclesiastical and secular sources in our records. Everything that I am talking to you about today in terms of AI usage is focused on the ecclesiastical records, specifically because the structure and kind of homogeneity of information presentation in those records makes them even more tractable for programmatic processing than a more free-form secular record. Now, I also think, and I've tried this before, the stuff we're building works with secular records to a point, at least for the transcription task. Okay, so sorry, this is going to be a long-winded answer. We'll try to make it as tight as possible. So roughly 1,000 folios for the transcription task. There's a second task here, which is once we have a transcription, a computer, machine, and human readable transcription, we need to also then transform that into like a structured representation of people and places and dates. Our training data set for that is much smaller because, again, that had to be created manually. That has only really been created in the past 18 months as it became exactly clear what that training data would need to look like. So that is on the order of probably like 100 folios max. So those are our two training sets. Now, in practice, the tool I'm using right this second is the OpenAI API, and that's because the API is, we could talk about, using an open source versus a closed source model, because OpenAI is in this moment where it's not even clear if it's open source or closed source moving forward. But the API is just really good. It has, allowed me to build code that is other people can use too because of the way in which the module is built. And this is also, I should say, this whole thing that I'm building, it's specifically for SSDA, but I conceive of this as a tool that could be used much more broadly, whether I develop it or somebody else. Somebody else is going to develop the fully formed version of this tool, and it's going to be a more wide use case. So we're using the OpenAI API, and despite the fact that we have, a 1,000 folio training set for transcription and a 100 folio training set for content extraction, for reasons of cost management and token count limiting, we're only using, maybe I should look at the actual live pipeline now, a few dozen images for the, not even like a dozen images for the transcription. So literally the training set that goes to the API for the transcription is like a dozen images. And for the content extraction, it's essentially the whole content extraction set, but still, talking just a few dozen examples. So short story long, these large language models, unsurprisingly, are extremely powerful tools, require training sets orders of magnitude smaller than something like Transkribus does for what are at least similar results for our documents, which have other peculiarities, which is why Transkribus was not a great fit, which I'd be glad to talk about. But that's where we're at right now in terms of overall data and what we're actually using in practice.
I just wanted to also add in that although my focus at the beginning when we started all this was the African component, these are records that also include the oldest records for indigenous people in our country and in Cuba. Also, we find, by the 19th century in Cuba, you begin to see Asiáticos no bautizados, and Europeans are in there also as godparents and as owners and as so on. So it had a focus looking for making real lives available for Africans who are supposedly erased, but it also brings us many, many indigenous people, many, many other sorts of Europeans and Asians and so on in these records wherever they are. And they're from the 16th century to the 20th century.
I have even more questions now, but we have some questions in the chat from Natalia da Silva Perez. Question for Daniel. Please tell us more about why XML and not TEI, and then as a follow-up, why in this instance Transkribus was not a good fit for this particular project.
So XML, not TEI. So this is circa like 4 or 5 years ago when I was really just kind of getting my feet wet this project. At that point, at least to my understanding, the kind of standard way of representing structured information about these kinds of documents or really any other would be XML. Obviously, I was aware of TEI. I made the decision that for kind of novice transcribers who are going to be uncomfortable with structured data, to try to keep it as simple as possible. Now, of course, as I, invented this XML schema on the fly, it rapidly got more complicated to the point that of all the one of the many decisions of this project I would do differently. If I was going to transcribe in XML today, I probably would use TEI. Now, follow up to that is that for this specific use case, I would not work in XML anymore. We work strictly in JSON now. All the API calls that I do are in JSON. So just having documents that are already structured as JSON is easier. It's also, I think the syntax is slightly more straightforward, again, for like history majors who are doing the transcribing to learn on the fly. But I think so, TLDR, if you're going to work in XML, do use TEI. But if you're starting from scratch, maybe consider JSON. Second answer, Transkribus. So one of the kind of peculiarities of this collection is based on, as Jane has described, the way in which it kind of grew organically from a really grassroots shoestring budget to like this really big monolithic remarkable collection, is that the quality of our images varies drastically over time. Quality both in terms of like literally resolution, quality in terms of the way the degree of professionality to which the image is framed. Basically, the images are all over the place. They are not, digital images produced by professional archivists and libraries. And that has implications for the tractability of those images for computational processing using a tool like Transkribus. So, now we're talking circa like 2-3 years ago. There are kind of two things that made Transkribus not a good fit for me, two and a half. One was that at that point, there just weren't any good publicly available models for Iberian language documents. That has changed. I noticed even I was in there again a week or two ago, that continues to change. There are better models now for Iberian language documents. Second thing was just that our images are not regular, and that presented challenges for a model like Transkribus. Third thing, kind of related to those two other things, was my concern was that if I was able to get good but not great results with Transkribus, it would be difficult for me to iterate on that because of kind of the black box nature of the tool. Now, I probably could have contacted the project team and move forward that way. But I felt more comfortable having a certain set of technical skills and maybe being overconfident in those skills, that if we built something from scratch, I would be better equipped to kind of tweak the performance of that tool on the fly and be aware of the inner workings of that tool. So that was the decision. I think, again, that decision I might make differently now. And we may even still use Transkribus in some capacity in the final version of this pipeline.
Amy, did you want to ask your question?
I love this discussion about transcription because it's a big part of what I do, but in the English language. But I'm curious about the accuracy, just roughly. Like, I'm really interested in this
So
using digital tools, but how does it take?
That'll
I
be-
guess I'm really wondering on a time management side, is there more or less time to verify the transcriptions?
So this is a big question, right? I could cherry pick an image for you right now and show you the pipeline on my other monitor, and it would pop out like a character perfect or close to character perfect transcription. I could also select an image at random for the collection and get complete garbled nonsense. So I think my direct answer to your question would be that the mature version of this tool is going to be able, and mature, not even in that like AI is going to need to advance further, but just that I and the team need to spend some time and really hammer this in shape. It's going to be able to really reliably produce, transcribed text that has character error rates and word error rates in excess of 80%. I'm sorry, error rates in below 20%, probably below 10%. Now, the question is that good enough, right? Is that it's not going to be, at the current level of technology, it's never going to be as good as a human transcriber. And if you want it to be, close to perfect, it's going to require eyes on it to do that. And, certainly it is way less time per image to clean up a few names than it is to transcribe the whole thing. But it doesn't save you all the labor, right? Now, my other answer to that, which I think may be a little bit more of a controversial answer in this room, is that I think if I'm able to scale it up and get error rates that are that low at scale, I'm comfortable sharing that data, like on the website, because like it's better than not having it, would be my argument. And everything I built in terms of building structured data, in terms of contents of the images, is built to be extremely conservative, like to not extrapolate, not guess. Now, there's still some work with the model to do that. But short story long, I think it is absolutely, if you're transcribing more than a few hundred images, it is absolutely worth your while to explore automation. If you have a really small collection, still at this point, do it by hand. But once you're scaling up at all, explore Transkribus. Don't try to build something yourself unless you have like hundreds of thousands of images, or at least tens of thousands.
Jim, I didn't think about putting up our website, but on each country, there's already quite a lot of transcriptions done by trained graduate students that you could use right now for your classes and that sort of thing, if it's not the technical that you're into. And each one also has resources that other people have done for each of those countries that are really valuable for research or teaching. And then there's a small section called projects where different students and participants in the teams like Elvita that you saw on the video have done about particularly interesting things for each country. So while Daniel's working on the technical part, we're also trying to make the website useful for teachers and for researchers, adding a lot of other sites and connections for other projects we work with. And I think you can find an awful lot of good stuff already up there that's at least usable while we work out the technical.
And I popped the website, the URL for the archive in the chat there, so I encourage folks to check it out. I was tooling around of it earlier, and it's pretty incredible. Suzanne Francis Brown had a question about the archive. Suzanne?
Hi, thank you. I got a part of an answer already, but I was wondering about the extensiveness of the archive, whether it was only the Spanish Portuguese language material and only also the Catholic material that was of interest in terms of its span.
Well, we work in those languages specifically because most other work is done in English. So we also have smaller collections from Benin and Angola and Cabo Verde. And we started in the church records, but we now do anything we can find while we're there. The goal is to get the oldest, most fragile, and endangered ones first. And actually, in response, I think, to your comment, we've had wonderful funding from the British Library Endangered Archives program. And if you go on their website, you can see spin-offs from one of our original team members was Oscar Grandillo Moraguez, who's gotten his own grants now in Cuba. And so they've been very wonderful about it. And we give them copies. We put everything up for everybody else to use. So the goal is to get as many people access, because all the kids that I work with and archivists and librarians in these other countries do not have these resources to travel and do the research that we're fortunate to be able to do. So we put it up, and it's our mission to train as many people while we can where we are with those grants, provide the equipment. We leave the equipment. They can then do whatever they want with it afterwards and work on whatever projects they want. And we have stipends written into those grants for the local students. So it's not an extractive, gringo thing going in and taking things out. We're sharing, and we're training, and we're funding, and we're providing permanent copies for this to the British Library and to our own.
I'd like to pick back up on the transcription and the data model again for just a moment. And one of the things that struck me about the size of the data set, 1,000 folios, all the names and the people that appear in there in terms. One of the things that my colleagues and I struggled with when I was at the UVA Law Library working on our Scottish Court of Session digital archive project was developing ways to disambiguate names, to try to identify unique individuals, particularly in Scotland and in the Highlands where everybody's got the same bloody last name, that becomes really hard, and figuring out, who's who. And so can you tell us a little bit about, or how are you dealing with identifying unique individuals? Can the models at this point, with a reasonable degree of accuracy, determine unique people? And what are the data points that you need to make that determination that you're talking about a unique individual as opposed to same persons across different records?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think this is sneakily maybe the most challenging question of all. And because, the most important thing actually like kind of bringing to light that somewhat corny but genuine kind of phrasing that was stitched together at the end of that video, which is that we're building together, building out these networks. The only way we're gonna be able to do that is by being able to disambiguate well. So it's a perfectly timed question too, because this is something I'm really pushing this semester. Like if I shared the docs with you, there's kind of 5 main steps of the pipeline. The first 4 are fully automated. The 5th one right now is not really automated at all. That 5th one is the disambiguation stuff. So I can talk about how I'm trying to tackle it, and I'm trying to tackle it on 2 fronts. One is, thinking logically about what makes a person a unique person, thinking logically about the constellation of characteristics we get from people in our records, and literally writing a mathematical formula that can perform a calculation there. The second is that I think that ultimately this is also a supervised learning task. And what I mean by that is we need many examples of disambiguations. So like the edge cases are easy. The ones where it's like very clearly not the same person because the names are different, they're born in separate centuries, whatever, those are easy. The ones where it's a slave owner with the same name within a few, months or years of it, also easy. The tricky ones are the ones where it's close, where we have, we're going to have many, many, many people in these records for whom we only have a first name, particularly for their birth. We're only going to, well, okay, sometimes, again, it depends, but like we're going to have many people who only have a first name, right? And there's going to be many, many people with all of the most commonplace Spanish first names. And then we're going to have a date associated with them because they're going to literally have appeared in the record. And we're going to have a place associated with them again because we know where these records came from. For a lot of people, for not necessarily the majority, but probably the plurality of mentions, those are all the data we're going to have. Those in and of themselves aren't that valuable, but what are valuable are the mentions when the people are the focal points of the record, right? When some person is being baptized or getting married or dying, because then we get other pieces of information that can help situate them. Specifically, we get information about people who they were connected to, right? Their parents, their children, their godparents, in some cases, grandparents. Once we have a mention of a person with some connections, then we have some pieces to kind of tie them together. And I think, so the way I ultimately think about how this is going to be solved is we're never going to have, except in rare cases, we're never going to have like a stone cold lock guarantee. But what I'm trying to do is essentially create a model that's at first going to be purely computational, ultimately be supervised, that will produce a percentage likelihood that two mentions of a potentially similar person are the same person. And I think that's doable. So I actually have an RA right now who's developing a tool to generate pairs of people, and then we're gonna have a person click the button. This is likely to be the same person, unlikely to be the same person, definitely the same, definitely not the same. I want to do that, a few thousand times, use that as training data. We also have, some actual examples of this from the collection. So I think that's all doable. And I think that's doable using both intuition in terms of what it is that makes a person a person. There are some other pieces of information we have that are more challenging, like, we get these ethno-linguistic descriptors that Jane was talking about. That's one of the most powerful pieces of information in our record. I'll be curious to learn how durable those are over time. I think those are probably somewhat durable. The things that I'm very confident aren't durable are kind of phenotype referencing words. Those can definitely change over a person's lifetime as their status changes, right? And I'm also very interested to see the first time we find somebody who is described as a person of color when they were enslaved is later described as not a person of color, as a free person. Those people absolutely exist in our records, right? So what's really cool about this problem, and why I began to talk too long about it, is that it's a really interesting combination of kind of content knowledge, of understanding the records, understanding what pieces of information appear and what they mean, and computational knowledge in terms of thinking about how we actually solve this problem in practice. But I'm confident we can do it. I think, in fact, down the line, the harder part of this is an interface problem, how we actually surface the information about people that we're like 70% sure are the same person, but we're not totally sure. And that's a different question that I'm not ready to tackle yet.
We'll come back to you when you've got an answer for that.
If I could just say, that's the mass scale, but it's amazing. Once in a while, we can find individuals who are fairly well known or infamous or, in some way have come to historical attention in these records. And, famous rebels, for instance, who start slave conspiracies in Cuba, but it turns out they were all members of the same brotherhood in the Catholic Church or members of the same militia, so on and so forth. And so you can find, if that individual is the person you're interested in, you can sometimes find all of their connections through these records as well. And I did a piece for Slavery and Abolition called Catholic Conspirators, and it was exactly about, the Placido Revolt and the revolt of the ladder and so on. And you can find these people, and they're so linked over and over again in these things as godparents and so on for each other, as marriage partners, whatever, that it's possible to track sort of individuals if that's what you're after too. And I saw Ross Michael Brown on here. I saw we've been working with the Stono rebels from Carolina, 1739, that supposedly were all killed, but some Angolan men, adults, start showing up right after that in Spanish Florida, which is where they were headed anyway. So sometimes you can make interesting connections to history mysteries that are already there.
Are there any other questions from our group here today?
Hi, Jane. I guess I just had a quick glance at the website, and which is trilingual. So in terms of the presentation, you've got the English, the Spanish, the Portuguese version. But what about the archives themselves in terms of the users and the transcriptions? And I guess it's a question to the two of you. I mean, are there any AI tools that could be helpful, or is that just the next sort of generation? And not something that so both a practical question about whether there is some kind of technology, but more fundamentally, do you want to have these, or a portion of them, available to non-Spanish speakers? How do you think about that, given that so much of your funding presumably is, some of it's come from the US? So just those kinds of questions a lot of us grapple with who work on non-English sources.
Well, our website, at least, we've already got, the translation possibility, and it may not be perfect, but it's what you have. We also even get Latin in some of these records, so we haven't tackled that yet. But there is, a variety of effort to get some of that transcribed. But Daniel may have a better answer for how to do it at the mass scale.
Yeah, so another thing that's interesting about working on this project in this space is that obviously the vast majority of the data, or again, at least the plurality of the data that something like GPT-4o is trained on, is in English. But we're working strictly, all the transcription, all the content extraction, working strictly in Spanish, with a few exceptions of actually translating some controlled vocabularies to English just to make my life easier. So the good news is, again, in my opinion, the modern generation of these large language models, we may be working strictly in Spanish, but like at an interface level moving forward, it'll be, literally the click of a button to be able to toggle that Spanish or Portuguese transcription to English. And I think for all intents and purposes, certainly given the kind of formulaicness of these entries, that will be not a problematic thing. And then in terms of the structured content that's extracted, right now, the way I'm handling the data, again, just to make my life and the team of not always bi or trilingual RA's lives easier, is that all of the words, all of like the, things like job descriptions and phenotype words, things like that have one-to-one or close to one-to-one English equivalents, I'm translating to English actually as part of the content extraction, with the intention that ultimately, that is all something that will be handled at an interface level with maintaining the trilingual functionality of the site. But there are certain words that are in Spanish and Portuguese that don't have clear translations. And from like a data perspective, those words are staying in Spanish and Portuguese. And that also, I think, to some degree, probably affects the way in which the model is understanding the information that it's extracting. So there's kind of multiple layers to that question, but short story long, I intend to have everything I do ultimately be available in all three languages that are on the website.
Fantastic. Yevon.
Oh yeah, I don't know if I'm going to formulate it much better than I did in the chat, but I was just curious if you know of any project attempting to do the same work for Haiti, because the state of the archives there is kind of similar to what you were describing, and also puzzling in so many ways for French colonial historians.
Yeah, I had a project ready to go when I was invited to go for the embassy in the northern part, and I was going to hit the churches after I did my talk, but we can't do it now. And we were going to do the northern churches and then drive down through the middle to get to San Juan de la Maguana and Azua, the Spanish ones at the south that are connected to the revolution that I work on too. But it's not quite possible now. But there is the brotherhood, the Library of the Brothers of, I forget which brothers now, but that was also funded, and there is we didn't do that, but David's Gagis's student got that grant and went down there and did the library, that was several years back. I mean, when it was a little safer yet.
We're coming to the end of our time here, and I want to, unless there's any other questions from the audience, I would like Jane and Daniel for you to both maybe reflect a little bit on um, where you've been and where you're going. We have a lot of folks in the room who are doing similar works or doing similar types of data projects or different stages, either as advanced as you are, or just beginning, or somewhere in the middle. And we talked a little bit about, well, if you could do it over again, you would do TEI as opposed to XML. But can I ask you to reflect on advice that you would give people who are just starting out, thinking about doing a project like this, multi-archival, data-driven type project, and what are some of the lessons learned that you might do differently if you were beginning again?
Well, I just keep going, trying to get out into the field before everything's gone. And the British Library has been wonderful about funding these smaller scale projects and letting us go. And then I share the models with everybody else and write letters of recommendation for everybody else so that it keeps on going forward that way. And as I said, our next one is in Mompox, Colombia, with some of the old team and some new people. And that's my effort to stay in the field because not everybody can do that. But then I can't do all of the technical wizardry that Daniel does, so he can share that. And I think he also already is with all those grads he's training as well.
Yeah, and then, on the digital side, I would say be very intentional from the very beginning of the project with how you're storing your data, how you're, literally the file names that you use to save your data, and then any derivatives you create from that data. One of the reasons why all the pieces in what is, at least at this stage, a fairly convoluted pipeline fit together is a really durable set of unique identifiers that date from like years and years and years ago, but which connect all the pieces of data that we have generated and will continue to generate in the future. And then the second kind of big blanket piece of advice would be, as soon as you're scaling in any way, don't do anything manually that you can automate. And even if that means you need to learn a little bit of Python or something, I strongly recommend it, because the second, you go from like manually clicking and dragging 1,000 files to, writing 5 lines of code that do that for you, you'll recognize the power of that. There's obviously kind of margins of efficiency there. But really, as soon as you're starting to kind of even dip your toe in this world, if you're operating with like even remotely large amounts of data, figure out a way to do what you're doing, have a computer do what you're doing instead of doing it yourself.
I think that's a great way to end it. Great advice. Jane, Daniel, thank you very much for your time today, for sharing your project with us and giving us a lot to think about. Folks, we'll be back actually next week. Usually we meet every 2 weeks, but we'll be back next week actually with Sophie White on Voices of the Enslaved, a DH approach to encountering the archive. So same bat time, same bat channel next week, and we will see you then. Thanks very much, everybody.